upcoming events. Next week on May 12th, Laura Morris from the California Partners Project, which was actually started by first partner Jennifer Seibel Newsom, Tim Kendall, the founder of Pinterest, and Paul Hastings from the Department of Psychology at UC Davis will be in conversation about COVID, social media, and how teens are coping, particularly in California. The week after that, May 19th, we're going to be welcoming UC System-Wide President Michael Drake for a wide-ranging question and answer session, largely fueled by the audience. As many of you know, Dr. Drake is an ophthalmologist, former chancellor at UC Irvine, and former president of The Ohio State University, so he's well equipped to discuss topics ranging from diversity and free speech to reopening the campuses after COVID. Well, that's a good segue into today's topic. Like many public universities, the University of California is grappling with ways to advance vital public missions, including diversity, equity, and inclusion, without violating other cherished principles such as academic freedom. The problem is this: to best serve a diverse student body requires a faculty prepared to embrace and nurture this diversity, but is requiring faculty under consideration for hire to write a diversity statement the best way to accomplish this goal? Here to address these questions and more is Professor Brian Socek. Dr. Socek is Chancellor's Fellow and Professor of Law at the UC Davis School of Law. He studies constitutional and statutory anti-discrimination law, refugee and asylum law, and research at the intersection of law and aesthetics. He's the author of numerous journal articles and amicus briefs, including several before the Supreme Court of the United States. Dr. Socek holds a PhD in philosophy from Columbia University and a JD from Yale Law School. Prior to coming to UC Davis, he clerked for the U.S. District Court in Connecticut and for the Second Circuit Court of Appeals. In 2020-2021, he was chair of the University of California's System-Wide Committee on Academic Freedom. And for all of these accomplishments, experiences, and more, he's well suited to talk with us today about diversity statements and what they mean for the University of California. So it's a great pleasure to present to you Dr. Brian Socek.
Well, it's a great pleasure to be here. So thank you for having me for that introduction. I want to thank also UC's National Center for Free Speech and Civic Engagement, which provided funding for the research that I've done in this area. And of course, also to my law school, UC Davis School of Law, for all its support. And so the topic of mine today, diversity statements, is something that you may or may not be familiar with. If you're a faculty member at a place like the University of California, you're almost certainly familiar with it because in recent history, you've probably been asked to submit a statement about your contributions to diversity, equity, and inclusion when you've gone up for tenure or a raise or promotion. If you're somebody who's applying to be a faculty member at the University of California, you definitely know about diversity statements because they are now required as part of the application for almost every search at all 10 campuses within the UC system. At my home campus, UC Davis, applicants will encounter something like this: that they're required to submit a statement about their past, present, and future contributions to promoting equity, inclusion, and diversity in their professional careers. And I should just note here that although I'm using diversity statements as shorthand in my title and throughout this talk, I'm really always talking about statements about contributions to diversity, equity, and inclusion. And it's important not to let my shorthand cause us to lose sight of that. I guess before going forward, I should also just clarify that despite the people on my title slide here, everything I'm saying here is me speaking for myself, not for any of the people that have supported me or have invited me, or even for the University Committee on Academic Freedom, which I currently chair, despite our ongoing involvement on these issues. So if you're not in one of the two camps, faculty or prospective faculty, you probably know about diversity statements from their critics. And their critics are many, and they're vocal, and they've achieved some prominent platforms. So we find op-eds and tweets and essays in the Los Angeles Times, the Washington Post from people as prominent as George Will, the Wall Street Journal from authors within the UC system. Abigail Thompson is a distinguished professor of math and former chair of the math department at UC Davis. And there's an interesting dynamic here, which is part of what I want to talk about in my remarks, which is that most of the criticisms have come from these kinds of sources that by their very nature don't allow for very nuanced discussion. They don't allow for a deep dive into legal doctrine about the First Amendment or academic freedom. And yet the claims that are being made in these sources are distinctively legal claims, and they're incredibly serious ones. Critics, after all, are alleging that schools like the University of California are engaging in unconstitutional viewpoint discrimination, which would violate the First Amendment. They're alleging that we're violating the academic freedom rights of our faculty, academic freedom, the principle on which our entire university's work depends. And finally, some are alleging that places like the University of California are reverting to the kind of loyalty oaths that were familiar during the Cold War era in the middle of the last century. These are serious charges, but because of the places where those charges have been made, there hasn't been a lot of serious legal discussion about to what extent those charges are true. So what I want to do is talk a bit today about what diversity statements are and how they are used, using the University of California as a case study. What are the criticisms? Where have they come from? And then to really dig in on this notion of how strong are the criticisms. And I just warn you that to do that, I'm going to have to take some detours into First Amendment doctrine, into principles of academic freedom, and a little bit of history about the loyalty oaths and what the enduring lessons of that history are. And then finally, the point of all that, to see, well, what are the strengths? To what extent do these criticisms, do these punches land? That will help instruct us on what use of diversity statements is consistent with the First Amendment, with academic freedom, and is not a return to the loyalty oaths of yore. So that's the goal here. And there's a reason, aside from just the fact that I happen to teach at the University of California, for using UC as the case study, both in my talk today and on the much, much longer article that this talk is based on, and which anyone here is welcome to email me to get a copy of that draft. UC is an important example, not just for its prominence within American higher education, but also because it self-consciously sees itself as a model, a national model for universities seeking to recognize and credit meritorious contributions that work to reconcile inequalities, as this letter from 2015 says. It's also an example, taking UC as an example is really to make it hard on myself. It's the example that's really the hardest to defend, and that for several reasons. One, we're a public university, which means we're subject to the constraints of the First Amendment. So the viewpoint discrimination charge lands in full force, if true, to the extent that it's true. Academic freedom. UC has a rich tradition, a very distinctive tradition of protecting academic freedom. Our policy is not just based on general First Amendment feels about academic freedom protections, but it's a contractual right that faculty here have. And so we can look with some specificity about whether these requirements violate that right. And finally, UC's sordid history with the loyalty oaths make us an especially attractive target for those who see diversity statements as a return to that kind of history. So the point is, let's take the tough example and see how well the criticisms do, even when they're at their most applicable. So that's my goal. I should just say, as another note at the outset, that no part of this project, of this talk that I'm giving today, is about whether diversity statements are, in general, a good idea. even whether diversity is a good idea. I have a lot of feelings about that, but that's not what I'm talking about today. I'm talking about for those universities that have adopted this as a value and adopted diversity statements as a means of promoting that value. For those institutions, UC absolutely among them, to what extent can we do so while remaining true to the Constitution and academic freedom? That's the goal. All right, so let's take a look at how UC has used diversity statements. Here's a letter that went out at UCLA in 2018 saying that from that point on, all candidates for jobs at UCLA will have to submit what they call an EDI statement describing past, present, future planned contributions to equity, diversity, and inclusion. And then in the following year, so starting in 2019, UCLA was going to require those statements for all ladder rank faculty promotions. Every 3 years, I put in an application to see how I'm going to progress, hopefully up the salary scale at my campus. And this would be as part of that. You'd be including a statement talking about your contributions to equity, diversity, and inclusion. Now, this is just the latest way of embodying a commitment that the University of California has for quite some time now. 15 years ago, the Faculty Senate proposed and the regents adopted a different kind of diversity statement. This is UC's institutional statement of values when it comes to diversity issues. And I just want to point out a couple things about Regents Policy 4400 because it really shapes the whole context here. First, it's got a very broad notion of diversity: race, ethnicity, gender, age, religion, language, disability, sexual orientation, gender identity, socioeconomic status, and even geographic diversity are all included. Second, continuing on with the statement, it talks about diversity as part of the core mission of the University of California and explains why that is, and talks about it as integral to the university's achievement of excellence. And these are points that I just want to flag because they'll become important later when we're talking about viewpoint discrimination. Finally, the statement, despite its, or in addition to its broad conception of diversity that it's working with, also does really zero in at the end on the acute need to remove barriers to the recruitment, retention, and advancement of talented students, faculty, staff from historically excluded populations who are currently underrepresented. So there is also a more targeted focus that's embodied in the Regents Policy. Now, that at the same time as the Regents Policy, an addition was made to the Academic Personnel Manual, the guide that governs everything we do as academic appointees at the University of California. And this emphasized that contributions in all areas of faculty achievement, promoting equal opportunity and diversity, should be given due recognition in the academic personnel process. When they say all areas, they mean all areas: public service, research, mentoring, advising of underrepresented populations, any steps we take to advance equitable access to education. All of these are supposed to be given due recognition within the academic personnel process. So again, in hiring, in tenuring, in promotion. Finally, and this, I just can't emphasize enough how important this is, that these contributions to diversity should be evaluated and credited in the same way as other faculty achievements. You're probably going to tire of hearing me return to this point, but I just can't overemphasize the way that confusions and in some cases criticisms of diversity statements, including confusions among my fellow faculty, including confusions from administration, would dissolve if people would remember the analogy between diversity statements and the other kinds of statements that faculty submit really on the regular. So we don't hear a lot of claims that the teaching statements we're required to submit in all these same contexts count as unconstitutional compelled speech. And the question is, why not? All right. Everything I've just said is about hiring and promotion in general, across the system, at all levels in all departments. There is, however, an importantly different way that diversity statements have been used in recent years. And these stem from a funding program that the legislature first passed in the 2016 budget, encouraging UC to experiment with more equitable forms of hiring. And the Office of the President has added some money to the funding, which has been around $2 million from the legislature in each of the years since then, and basically has had campuses competing by proposing different ways of experimenting with their hiring processes. One of them that's garnered a lot of the attention in this area, actually several of them, all happened in the 2018 cycle, when these grants went to Berkeley, Davis, Merced, and Riverside. Let me focus on the Davis one, since it's the one I know best and was closest to. In fact, I was part of one of these searches. 8 of our schools, so of all the hiring searches in Davis, 8 of these searches that were held in the 2018-19 academic year took on a specific focus where we were looking for research faculty with a strong commitment to teaching, research, and service that will promote the success of underrepresented minority students, here defined as African American, Latina, Chicano, Hispanic, and or Native American. So 8 searches with this as a specific focus of research, teaching, or experience, and diversity defined far more narrowly than what we have just in Regents Policy 4400. One other thing, the experimental part of the search was trying new procedures in how to run the search. At Davis, during these 8 searches, again, there were lots of other searches going on elsewhere on campus, but in these 8 searches, the initial screening of candidates was based on evaluation of the candidates' diversity statements. In other words, we got people's anonymized diversity statements and scored those in order to make a list of candidates that we wanted to proceed to the next round of the selection process, at which point we got the rest of their applications, including their name, their research interests, all that kind of thing, their teaching scores, everything else you would normally have in a faculty application. Now, I highlight this because this is not the normal way that we do searches. This is not the normal thing we look for, this very focused targeting of people who have research activities addressing the needs of African American, Latino, and Native American students. And it's not the normal procedure that we use. This will again become important also. How then do we evaluate diversity statements? Well, there's a lot of variation here. I have months and months of Public Records Act requests where I've been gathering different kinds of evaluation grids, like this one originally prepared at Irvine. This is a very general one. As you can see here, points given to awareness, to your demonstrated track record, and to your specific plans, on a 1 to 5 point basis. This is the kind of general thing that could then presumably be given more content within individual searches by individual committees. There's a lot to fill in here. Contrast that with some of the rubrics that have been used by specific committees, including ones like this that were used as part of those 8 searches in 2018. Here, underrepresented minorities is specifically defined in terms of the 3 groups we already talked about. And there's just a lot more content given to how we should score these diversity statements, some of which would be problematic, if not problematic in general, as we'll see, would certainly be problematic if used as the rubric for evaluating these statements across the university. So for example, may discount the importance of diversity, maybe are written as, let's see, down at the bottom there, may provide reasons for not considering diversity in hiring or sees it as antithetical to academic freedom or the university's research mission. There are some questions that seem to ask about people's views on diversity, and we'll be circling back to the extent to which that's a good idea. This is not meant as something to read the words, but just really as the visual to see just how detailed some of these rubrics can become. This is a rubric that was prepared at Berkeley, but has since been used on several other campuses. Well, this is what has garnered the criticism. So, and this is a good example of what the criticism has looked like. It takes a statement put out by a public interest organization, FIRE, the Foundation for Individual Rights in Education, which has done work in this area for years and years now, much before this. It takes their statement made in response to UCLA's newly expanded requirement and then expands on it. Jeffrey Flyer is a former dean of the Harvard Medical School. And he says, requiring such statements is an affront to academic freedom. Well, this is how it works. Dean Flyer's tweet was reported upon in the Chronicle of Higher Education. He then wrote a full-length essay, op-ed in the Chronicle against diversity statements. This is accompanied by op-eds, as we've already seen, in the Los Angeles Times, an essay by Professor Thompson, again, the chair then of the math department at UC Davis, in her professional organization's newsletter. That got turned into a Wall Street Journal opinion and a response from my chancellor. Finally, people like George Will reporting on the whole fracas. Just to be clear, the fact that these criticisms have started on Twitter and then taken place largely through op-eds does not mean that they haven't had an effect beyond the Twitterverse. So here we see someone who has written on this subject as op-eds, who's also a lawyer seeking plaintiffs to sue the University of California for these policies, Daniel Ortner. And having high-powered support from people like Brian Leiter, University of Chicago law professor and philosopher, very influential blogger, who helped him has helped him try to drum up plaintiffs for such a lawsuit. At UC Davis, the first and now second faculty-wide resolutions of my career at UC Davis called last year for and against the use of diversity statements. The first resolution saying they shall not be mandatory narrowly lost. The second resolution, diversity statements are useful, passed by a slightly larger margin. Hundreds of comments filed on either side by members of the faculty over the course of these two resolutions. So, and I can just report as chair of the System-Wide Academic Freedom Committee, this has been an ongoing issue from the committees, people bringing complaints to the committees at all 10 campuses. There are really three different types of criticisms that are made. You've already heard me refer to them, but here we have them. The charge that the use of diversity statements is viewpoint discriminatory. That's one. The idea that it's an affront to academic freedom. That's two. And finally, this idea that it's the university's new loyalty oath, something like a political litmus test, like the anti-communist oaths of the 1940s and 50s and 60s. So I want to dig in a little bit now on how to think about these three critiques. So, viewpoint discrimination. The problem here, this just really encapsulates the problem with these criticisms coming mostly from places where we can't dig into the legal subtleties. We end up hearing criticisms like this. At public universities, viewpoint discrimination in hiring violates the First Amendment. Full stop. Now that's false. It is not the case that viewpoint discrimination is not allowed when we engage in the normal academic personnel process. We as academics are regularly evaluating each other's ideas when we hire somebody, when we're evaluating our colleagues for tenure. That's the whole point of the process. This is the same when we evaluate our students. grading our students' exams is a form of viewpoint discrimination of a sort that would be absolutely just patently unconstitutional if we were making such judgments and enforcing them with real penalties out on the quad. Out on the quad, where normal First Amendment principles apply, there are no wrong ideas, right? And I can't compel somebody to speak. Not so in the classroom, not so within the application or tenure process, where of course I call on my students, where of course I tell them that things are wrong, where of course I judge them, where the whole point of tenure, as I said, is to decide whether somebody is making a contribution to our scholarly knowledge. Okay. I think a better way to think about it, before delving into some of the case law here, which is incredibly complicated, I think this slide really expresses our deeper intuitions about viewpoint discrimination. So Robert Post, dean of the Yale Law School, former dean of the Yale Law School, before that faculty member at Berkeley, who wrote the University of California's current academic freedom policy, Dean Post says, imagine a chemistry department giving research grants only to students who oppose abortion rights. Now, this might seem outrageously viewpoint discriminatory, but what really bothers us here is that the criteria the department is using are completely irrelevant to any legitimate educational objective of the department. Now, this is something different. It's not just, are we discriminating on the basis of viewpoints? Because of course, the chemistry department can do that in any number of ways. It's, are we discriminating on viewpoints that are irrelevant to the legitimate educational objectives of that department? I think that's going to be a really important shift. So I said before I get into the legal doctrine, but really I'm not going to bore you too much with the legal doctrine. If you want the deep dive, email me and I'll send you the article. But part of the problem here, just to flag what's going on, is there are deep questions about just what the law is in regard to faculty evaluations in these areas. Part of the problem is there's a deepening circuit split among the courts of appeals in this country about whether professors should be treated like just any other government employee when it comes to the First Amendment, or whether we have more or perhaps even fewer protections than any other, than the worker at the Department of Motor Vehicles. Complicated questions there, but because of the uncertainty on those questions, I think it's useful to look to lots of other related or analogous areas where these kinds of viewpoint discrimination questions have come up. There are cases that we refer to as certification cases, where a student in the nursing program mouths off on Facebook and looks completely unprofessional, and her school has to decide whether they're going to allow him or her to continue in the program. University admissions requirements give rise to these kinds of judgment calls. Questions about the government as editor or curator or administrator of a public funding program. Think the cases about the National Endowment for the Arts, or the university selecting its commencement speakers, or hosting programs like this. Whole different set of things. If I said to Dr. Kravitz, hey, I'd like to come speak with the Sacramento Center about my views on why the Earth is flat, I'm sure he wouldn't have given me this slot. So that's to say viewpoint discrimination is going on. And in these contexts, it's accepted within certain limits. Viewpoint discrimination in government contracts these cases have lots of relevant things to teach us. And finally, political patronage cases, if given governmental office will only hire Democrats, something like that, also have relevant things to say. But I'm just going to skip ahead and give you what I see as the general takeaway of all that. Courts give increased deference to these decision makers, these governmental decision makers, and their viewpoint discrimination when they reflect the faculty's professional judgment, when they're made according to academic norms, disciplinary norms, on matters directly relevant to the program in question. So my nursing candidate that got thrown out of the program because he mouthed off on Facebook, we might look to well, what are the professional norms surrounding nursing? And was the mouthing off on anything that would really call into question, not just their general moral character or just whether we agree with him or her politically or not, but whether that says something about their fitness to do that kind of job, such that we don't want to give them our stamp of approval. Finally, these cases really emphasize the need to leave space for speech as a citizen, for speech outside the bounds of whatever program contract you happen to be getting funded through. So when I say that this is a big shift from just the slogan, no viewpoint discrimination, which is just patently false, to no viewpoint discrimination that's irrelevant to any legitimate educational objective of the department, the reason why I think this is such a big shift is, if relevance is what we really care about, then notice what is permissible in terms of how we use diversity statements is actually going to vary. Relevant to what? Well, it's going to vary by job. Which position are you applying for? Whether you're an applicant or a tenure applicant or somebody going for a raise. And also by discipline, where what is a relevant thing to ask somebody in law is going to be different than in the medical school. Finally, that raises the question, who gets to decide what's relevant? And here, the answer really has to be experts in that discipline. And that brings us to topic 2, which is academic freedom. Because academic freedom sometimes is just used to talk about the First Amendment rights of professors. And to that extent, we've just covered that topic in talking about viewpoint discrimination. But it also means something different, the kind of thing that's enshrined, again, in the academic personnel manual at UC. This is the policy that Dean Post wrote. It's enshrined in the 1940 principles from the American Association of University Professors. It's in the contracts of academics at universities all over the country. So these aren't necessarily First Amendment claims, although they could be. They could just be contract claims. They could just be due process claims. I shouldn't say just there, I teach procedure. They are also contract claims. They're also procedural claims based on these contractual protections for academic freedom as the thing that makes universities run. And here's what it basically means. My scholarship, my teaching is to be judged according to the disciplinary standards of my field or fields. And that should be done by the disciplinary experts in those fields, as opposed to being judged by administrators, by legislators who may or may not like what I teach or say, by donors, by public outcry in general. Those aren't the judges of our scholarship and teaching. Instead, we're judged according to disciplinary expertise of our colleagues. Now, that is the notion of academic freedom that some have said is being violated here. And here are the criticisms. That these mandates are coming from the administration, not the faculty. That there's a reliance in some of these searches, like the ones I showed you in the 8 Davis searches, on cluster hires, which lessen the importance of disciplinary norms and expertise. That people are getting punished for their extramural speech. That we might lock in viewpoints, especially if we look at diversity statements at the threshold stage, that we're only going to get people that are committed to this value, and then they'll be self-perpetuating. And finally, that including these kinds of considerations is going to make academic work look ideologically driven rather than academically driven in the mind of the public. These are the criticisms. And there is some truth to some of them that I think we need to recognize. So for example, I think it is important to recognize that rubrics, as opposed perhaps to mandate, as opposed to requirements, but the rubrics for judging diversity statements should not be imposed from above by administrators. There needs to be faculty involvement in the criteria that we apply to these statements. Because after all, remember the principle I said at the outset, we need to think of diversity statements analogously to other reports that faculty file, the other measures of our scholarly excellence, right? Our teaching and our research reports, where it's pretty much unheard of that the administration would dictate, certainly without local faculty input, a way of evaluating each other's teaching or research. We don't get rubrics for that, certainly not specific ones. So nor should there be, this is the takeaway based on academic freedom, nor should there be when it comes to diversity statements. Okay, the last of the critiques, that this is a loyalty oath or a political test. This dates back to the anti-communist loyalty oaths imposed, causing several dozen UC faculty members to get fired in 1949, 1950. As a result of that controversy, the regents in 1969 issued a standing order that no political test shall ever be considered in the appointment or promotion of any faculty member or employee at the University of California. So the question is, are these statements talking about your contributions to diversity, equity, and inclusion a political test? Are they an oath of loyalty that's required to say that these are values you believe in? Well, if so, that would be problematic because the California Supreme Court struck down the state's loyalty oaths in 1967, note, for violating freedom of association. It's a guilt by association principle. That was the problem. I might just have some abstract interests in communism. I joined the party, and now it's guilt by association. I'm tarnished with the more violent desires of some of my fellow party members. That's what the Constitution doesn't allow. Some cases thought that these oaths were void for vagueness. There's an interesting dynamic going on in the loyalty oath criticisms of diversity statements, where some people worry that terms like diversity are too vague to be useful, that it's unfair to judge faculty on terms that they feel are undefined. Whereas others say, no, this is a political litmus test, which makes it sound as if this is a very specific thing that we're being asked to sign on to. There's some tension there in the criticisms. But I think what's going on is this idea that everyone knows, even if the terms themselves seem vague, everyone knows what the university really wants people to say. And that's something that gets alleged frequently. Professor Bainbridge is a law professor at UCLA. He published publicly his diversity statement that he filed a couple years ago, where he talked about ways in which he had served conservative students at UCLA feel included, or students with certain religious backgrounds. And he ended with a kind of chuckle, I'll let you know if I get the raise. Now that's a joke that's been repeated all over the internet. And in fact, even in law reviews, for example, Richard Epstein writing in the University of Illinois Law Review, Professor Bainbridge shouldn't hold his breath waiting for his raise, because there's this thought again that everybody knows what you have to say in order to get your raise through your diversity statement. Well, this is slightly trolling, but I asked a few weeks ago, whatever happened to that raise? And it turns out Professor Bainbridge did get it. So unclear what to make of the everybody knows argument. But still, I want to take seriously the no guilt by association idea, that we need to judge people based on what they do, not based on what parties they join or beliefs they might abstractly hold. And we need to leave space for dissent outside the confines of the job. So speech as citizen, or for faculty, space for dissent within institutional governance. So when you speak in the faculty senate, that shouldn't be held against you in the context of your diversity statements. And we need to structure diversity statements in a way that allows for that. So now, finally, let me just end by looking at a really bad diversity statement requirement. So the provost says, I'm going to require everybody to demonstrate their belief that diversity is a compelling governmental interest, just like Justice Powell said in University of California v. Bakke, the decision that really set the parameters, the modern parameters for affirmative action in higher ed. Now that sounds a bit outlandish, and yet here's Brian Leiter saying that by conditioning employment in effect on believing that Bakke was correctly decided, that diversity is the most important reason for affirmative action, that's how Berkeley, he says, has violated the Constitution, really requiring fealty to the Bakke decision. Well, what's the problem? And this is what I'll close with. drawing from the analysis of the criticisms that we've just gone through, here's what's wrong. And that suggests then how to do it right. Here's what's right in our practice. It's top down and not developed by the faculty. So instead, we need rubrics that have faculty involvement in how people will be evaluated, just like we do in every other area in which faculty is evaluated. This is university-wide, not discipline-specific. It applies to all jobs. This is the relevance problem. There's nothing especially relevant. Having a concern about BACI isn't especially relevant in most of the jobs in the university. It employs an especially thick conception of diversity, a view of diversity that's more like a worldview. And finally, it's focused on views, not actions, and leaves no room for outside dissent. And just to be clear, what I mean by that is a diversity statement requirement that's focused on actions. A faculty member could comply with that, could write a great one, while still thinking that diversity might not be the thing the university should be this focused on. Those wouldn't be incompatible. Again, look at analogy with teaching. I can just submit one of the best teaching statements anyone's ever seen, showing, look at my great teaching evaluations, et cetera, even if I happen to believe and write op-eds saying, I think UC forces us to teach way too much and it's all just a distraction from my research. Those two things are not incompatible, and neither should diversity statements be incompatible or not available to people that have conflicting views, so long as they're asking for, what have you done? How have you helped a diverse array of students to succeed or thrive at the University of California? Not, what do you think about diversity? How much do you believe in it as an abstract value? Seeing the time, I'm going to stop there so I can take questions you have, but thanks so much to so many of you for coming today and talking about this with me.
Great, I'm going to go ahead and just thank you very much, Dr. Sochek, for a great talk today. And so I'm going to give Brooke just a sec here to go ahead and just turn off the recording.